This is David Kroodsma with Hub Culture, and I'm joined today by Andy Revkin, who has been an environmental reporter for over a quarter century and wrote for the New York Times for over 15 years. Andy, there's been an erosion in the last few years of public belief in climate science. And I'm just curious if that has surprised you, and more generally, if the public trajectory of public opinion around this issue has surprised you as someone writing about it for 20 years.
There's a good news, bad news aspect to what's happened the last few years. The good news is, frankly, I don't think people were that bought into the global warming science to begin with. When you look at the social surveying and polling, and you ask people what they really care about, when you just say, what worries you? It's never on the list. Never was 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even right after the movie came out, Al Gore's movie. And then, so public opinion on climate has always been pretty shallow. Mm-hmm. And so I think what we've seen is kind of a slosh of a shallow pan. Doesn't mean a lot, frankly. That's the good news is it doesn't mean a lot, that there's been an erosion. The bad news is people don't care about climate change. Yeah. They never have. They haven't through this whole stretch I've been writing about it. It's still seen as a sort of a someday, somewhere issue, which again, for the most part, the real hardcore impacts are still someday and somewhere in that sense. They're not in our backyard. So that's the challenge, as sociologists like Tony Leserowitz of Yale have pointed out clearly. The challenge is, once you know how people think, then how can you get better integration of this kind of risk into their brains?
So how does that make you feel as someone who's been trying to communicate this issue for so long?
Well, it's one reason I left full-time journalism.
Yeah.
You know, I've moved to Pace University. I still write my .Earth blog at the New York Times every day, sometimes several times a day, and I tweet and do all that stuff. And I'll still be writing books and longer articles, but I'm trying to get a clearer sense, as I've said here in Mexico at this meeting, that I think we're at a great moment of new possibilities for conveying stories in fundamentally new ways, whether through imagery, as I've explained. There's some amazing ways to show data visually that I think captivate people in ways they would never get in words. And then there's ways to share information now globally that just weren't there a few years ago.
And you think those are the most exciting ways that we can communicate this issue?
Yeah, you know, we're on a planet, as again, Leserowitz's, when he talked about the Gallup poll data from the globe, you know, there are billions of people on planet Earth right now who have never heard of the phrase climate change. And within a few years, because of cell phone technology, there's no reason they can't start learning about energy and climate and related issues in ways that matter to them wherever they are.
And what advice would you give to those of us who are trying to communicate climate change to people?
Well, you know, the key thing is to get to the root of it. Be sure you're aware of as I've said on the blog, you know, part of the climate challenge is inside the head. So just be aware of that as you're framing what you're saying. Thinking creatively about, again, visualizations and story, and getting people to one of the great untapped challenges is getting people to reintegrate with what science is, that it's a journey and that it's lumpy and has curves in the road. And so if science is not perfect, that doesn't mean you don't do anything. It doesn't mean you don't know anything. It means we know a huge amount about climate change. That some of the details, including important ones, we don't know very well. But that doesn't mean you don't act. So it's just being aggressive and creative and finding, keeping out the idea of working with new ways to also working interactively with your audience. Because that's, again, like through blogging, or where they're telling you what makes sense or doesn't make sense. If you post something that's complicated or obtuse or wrong, you hear about it in a microsecond. And so then it becomes kind of a conversation about the issue instead of just sort of someone handing down information. One reason I'm not so sad about the end of the 20th century model of journalism is because, and I grew up with it and I loved it, you know, Walter Cronkite used to every night while we were having supper, that's the way it is, Tuesday, November 20th, 1967. But no one, you know, we live in a world where there isn't that's the way it is anymore. It's more complicated than that. So I think getting more comfortable with new ways of having that information flow, I think, is vital.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Andy, so much.
Sure.
I'm David Kroodsma with Hub Culture, joined by Andy Revkin, an environmental journalist for over a quarter century.